President Trump getting ready to take a major swipe at former President Barack Obama's legacy on climate change.
The president's executive order today calls for reviewing the Clean Power Plan.
According to EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, the president's order will replace the Obama plan with a pro-growth approach to regulation.
2 months after he became president, Donald Trump arrived at the Environmental Protection Agency for a ceremony unlike anything the agency had ever seen.
I want to acknowledge the truly amazing people behind me on this stage, our incredible coal miners.
He was there to fulfill a campaign promise.
We love our coal miners.
To begin undoing one of President Obama's signature achievements in the fight against climate change, the Clean Power Plan.
You know what was most awkward about watching the signing of that executive order was the fact that they were doing it at EPA.
Former EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy.
To me, it was not just a signal to his base, but a real shot across the bow to the agency itself. And it was disturbing.
The miners told me about the attacks on their jobs and their livelihoods. They told me about the efforts to shut down their mines, their communities, and their very way of life. I made them this promise: we will put our miners back to work.
Mr. Trump, he acknowledged me in the audience.
Murray Energy Corp CEO Bob Murray.
And if you look at the press releases on it, the back of my bald head is in the pictures.
New York Times reporter Eric Lipton.
The notion that Bob Murray of Murray Coal was at the EPA headquarters celebrating action by the EPA was like so completely fiction.
My administration is putting an end to the war on coal.
I would say that people were really devastated by that.
Former EPA head of water, Betsy Sutherland.
That it was considered to be really an open slap in our face.
What it conveyed is this is a hostile takeover.
Former EPA head of civil enforcement, Eric Schaefer.
You, the scientists and lawyers and engineers at the agency, are no longer valued. This is a political operation.
It was a victory for Scott Pruitt, the president's new EPA administrator. For years, he'd been leading the fight against environmental regulations from Washington, like the Clean Power Plan.
Ready?
We're ready.
In working for both Bushes and for Clinton and Obama, I can say no previous administration has done what the Trump administration is doing at EPA now. There is a clear and present danger to public health and safety in this country that the repeals this administration is going to undertake are going to go forward. They're not going to slow down.
Bob Murray.
It was 8 years of pure hell under the Democrat Party and Obama. But we won. It's a wonderful victory.
As Trump and his team prepared for the transition, they reached out to Myron Ebell with a surprising offer.
He said, well, Mr. Trump believes that the federal government cannot go on the way it is. And I said, well, I agree with that. And that it requires fundamental transformation. I said, well, I agree with that. And that he thinks that the EPA is one of the obstacles to getting the economy going again in heartland America. And I said, well, I certainly agree with that. And Mr. Trump has even said that he wants to abolish the EPA. And I said, well, I agree with that. And he said, well, that's why we're asking you to run the Trump transition team for the EPA.
Gina McCarthy.
Well, it gave me a clear understanding of the direction that the administration was planning to head, because Mr. Ebell is one of the big and most vocal climate deniers.
Ebell began helping to create a plan for the Trump EPA. And it wasn't long before Scott Pruitt emerged as the pick to take it over.
What was your reaction when the president announced Scott Pruitt?
Total delight.
Bob Murray.
And did you have a hand in recommending Scott Pruitt to the president to be EPA administrator?
No comment.
No comment.
Oklahoma's Attorney General Scott Pruitt named the nominee of President-elect Donald Trump to lead the Environmental Protection Agency.
A leading critic of the EPA now in line to take its helm.
A dozen of Bob Murray's coal miners showed up at the U.S. Senate in January for Scott Pruitt's confirmation hearing.
How are you all doing?
For Pruitt, it was a chance to explain why a critic of the EPA should run it.
I believe there is a very important role for the Environmental Protection Agency. In fact, its involvement in protecting our air quality and improving our nation's waters is extremely important. And the EPA has served a very valuable role historically. We must reject as a nation the false paradigm that if you're pro-energy, you're anti-environment, and if you're pro-environment, you're anti-energy.
Pruitt also expressed his doubts about climate change.
Let me say to you, science tells us that the climate is changing, and then human activity in some manner impacts that change. The ability to measure with precision the degree and extent of that impact and what to do about it are subject to continuing debate and dialogue, and well, it should be.
But Senate Democrats had strong doubts.
The fear is that the nomination of Mr. Pruitt is a nomination designed to protect the fossil fuel industry and not the environment.
We have a meeting agenda from the Republican Attorney General's Association meeting at the Greenbrier.
Sheldon Whitehouse, a former attorney general from Rhode Island, pressed Pruitt on his ties to industry.
Mentions a private meeting with Murray Energy.
What the American public deserves is the assurance that people who take government positions are making their decisions based on the merits, not based on prior relationships, present relationships, the expectation of future relationships. The priority was to get at the conflicts of interest.
You helped raise money for the Republican Attorney General's Association. While you were a member of its executive committee, they received $530,000 from Koch Industries, $350,000 from Murray Energy, and $125,000 from Devon Energy. Did you solicit, in your role at the Republican Attorney General's Association, any of that funding?
I attended fundraising events as an attorney general, along with other attorneys general, with respect to the RAGA.
And did you solicit? Did you ask them for money for RAGA?
As I indicated, I attended fundraising events.
Senator Whitehouse.
In the ordinary course, his conflicts of interest would disqualify him from this position. And were it not for the power of the fossil fuel industry in Congress, then I don't think he would have had a shot.
One of President Trump's most controversial cabinet picks has made it through the Senate. Scott Pruitt was just sworn in moments ago. He will run the Environmental Protection Agency, much to the dismay of many environmentalists.
A week after Pruitt was confirmed, the president gave his marching orders.
Today, this executive order directs each agency to establish a regulatory reform task force.
It was a mandate to all federal agencies to slash regulations.
The New Yorker's Jane Mayer.
What you see now with the Trump administration is the triumph of the anti-environmental movement.
Should I give this pen to Andrew? Dow Chemical.
They are now in control of the government and in control of the regulatory process in a kind of a brazen way we haven't seen before. There's a tendency to ignore what's going on in places like the EPA, and really radical things are happening there, and people aren't paying attention.
Well, let me tell you, there's been a change of direction, obviously, at the EPA, because the war on coal ended, the war on fossil fuels ended.
To help him, Pruitt hired people with deep ties to industry.
Eric Lipton, New York Times.
It's startling to see the class of people that he's surrounded himself with, the lawyers and lobbyists who were fighting alongside of him to challenge the Obama rules. They are now setting the policies that they were so involved with trying to kill. He is making the regulated the regulators.
Pruitt also relied heavily on his fellow Oklahoman, the Senate's leading climate change denier, James Inhofe.
We keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record. I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball.
Several of Pruitt's senior advisors worked for Inhofe at one time.
Very cold out, very unseasonal. It happens the person who is running the EPA right now is a good friend of mine. In fact, his chief of staff was my chief of staff. So the abuses that we were subjected to by the overregulation for the 8 years under Obama are things that we can now change. And we are in the process of doing that. People are not aware of it.
Scott Pruitt
promised an aggressive rollback of environmental regulations that had been put in place by former President Obama.
The Environmental Protection Agency dropped a requirement that oil and gas interests report information on methane emissions. Scott Pruitt said withdrawing the rule will ease burdens on business.
The new head of the Environmental Protection Agency reversed steps to ban a controversial, widely used pesticide linked to potential health problems in children and farm workers.
Soon, Scott Pruitt's EPA had moved to delay or roll back more than 24 rules and regulations.
Scott Pruitt, he is the star on the Trump team, getting more done.
Bob Murray.
Probably than any other appointee to date. I gave Mr. Trump what I called an action plan very early. It's about 3.5 pages. And of what he needed to do in his administration. He's wiped out page 1.